The heavy air inside the funeral hall made it hard to breathe. The room was filled with the scent of fresh flowers, but nothing could cover the sorrow hanging over the people gathered there. Soft whispers, quiet sobs, and the occasional sound of tissues being pulled from boxes filled the silence. Everyone had come to say goodbye to Daniel, a young man whose life had been cut short too soon. Maria, his mother, sat in the front row, her hands gripping a small piece of cloth that had belonged to her son. She had not let go of it since she arrived. Her heart felt like it had been ripped apart, and no amount of comforting words from family or friends could take away the pain. She could hear people saying things like, "He was such a kind soul, and he didn't deserve this." But none of it helped. Her son was gone, and no words could bring him back. Maria's mind kept replaying the moment she had received the terrible news. It had been a normal evening. She had been in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when her phone rang. The voice on the other end had sounded distant, almost unreal. "We're sorry to inform you. There was an accident." The words had shattered her world in an instant. She had refused to believe it at first. How could Daniel be gone? He had left the house that morning, full of energy and plans for the future. But now, he was lying in a coffin in front of her. Despite everything, something in her heart didn't feel right. She couldn't understand why, but there was an uneasiness in her chest, a feeling she couldn't shake off. Maybe it was the shock, maybe it was grief, or maybe it was something more, something real. Maria had not seen Daniel's body after the accident. The funeral arrangements had been made so quickly that she hadn't even had a chance to say a proper goodbye. As she sat there, staring at the closed coffin, a thought began to form in her mind. Why hadn't she insisted on seeing him one last time? Everyone had told her it was better this way, that remembering him as he was would bring her more peace. But was that really true? Or was there something they weren't telling her? Her fingers trembled as she gripped the armrest of her chair. The service was about to begin. The priest cleared his throat, preparing to speak. But Maria couldn't focus on his words. Her heart pounded in her chest. An overwhelming urge took over her body. She had to see Daniel. She had to know for sure. Without thinking, she stood up. The sudden movement made a few people glance at her, but she didn't care. "I want the coffin open," she said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. A hush fell over the room. Some people gasped. Others exchanged nervous glances. The funeral director, an older man with a kind but tired face, took a step forward. "Mrs. Maria, are you sure? It's best to." "I'm his mother," Maria interrupted, her voice stronger this time. "I need to see my son." For a moment, no one moved. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the funeral director sighed and nodded. Slowly, two men stepped forward and began undoing the latches on the coffin. The room was so silent that Maria could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. As the lid was lifted, Maria took a deep breath. But nothing could have prepared her for what she saw next. People gasped. Some even took a step back in shock. Maria's eyes widened, and her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, hoping she was imagining things. But no, what she was seeing was real. The body inside the coffin was not her son. Maria's breath stopped for a moment. She blinked, hoping her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, what she was seeing was real. The person lying in the coffin was not her son. Gasps filled the room as people leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening. Some covered their mouths in shock, while others whispered among themselves. Maria felt her legs grow weak, and she gripped the edge of the coffin to steady herself. This wasn't possible. There had to be a mistake. The funeral director looked just as stunned as everyone else. His face turned pale, and he quickly stepped closer, peering into the coffin as if he, too, couldn't believe his own eyes. This can't be," he mumbled. He looked at Maria, his hands shaking slightly. "Mrs. Maria, I don't understand. Your son was brought here 2 days ago. I personally received the body from the hospital." Maria's heart pounded in her chest. "Then explain this," she demanded, pointing at the man inside the coffin. He was a stranger. His face was unfamiliar, his features completely different from Daniel's. Even the clothes he was dressed in, a formal suit, were nothing like what Daniel would wear. "Where is my son?" she cried, her voice filled with a mix of fear and anger. The priest, who had been standing silently until now, stepped forward. "There must be some mistake," he said gently, trying to calm the growing tension in the room. "Perhaps the hospital." "No, this is not a mistake," Maria interrupted, shaking her head. "This is something else. Someone needs to tell me where my son is." The guests, who had come to mourn Daniel, were now filled with confusion and fear. Some looked around as if expecting an answer to suddenly appear. Others hurriedly checked their phones, whispering that they had never heard of such a thing happening before. One of Daniel's closest friends, Mark, stepped forward, his face full of worry. "Maria, are you sure? Could this be? Could this man have changed because of the accident?" Maria turned sharply toward him. "I know my son. Do you think a mother wouldn't recognize her own child?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This wasn't just about grief anymore. This was something much bigger. The funeral director rubbed his forehead, clearly shaken. I will check the records immediately," he said before rushing toward his office. Maria didn't wait. She turned to Mark. "We're going to the hospital. Now." Mark hesitated, but nodded. "I'll drive," he said. The drive to the hospital was tense. Maria sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her mind racing. What had happened to her son? Had there been a terrible mix-up, or was something more sinister going on? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When they arrived, Maria stormed into the hospital, heading straight for the front desk. The receptionist looked up, startled. "How can I help you?" she asked. Maria didn't waste time. "My son, Daniel, was brought here after his accident. I need to see the records. Now." The receptionist hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't share patient records without proper authorization." Maria slammed her hand on the counter. "Listen to me," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "I just opened my son's coffin, and he wasn't inside. Now you tell me where he is." The woman's eyes widened, and she quickly typed something into her computer. A moment later, she frowned. "That's strange. His file is here. But—" Maria leaned in. "But what?" The receptionist hesitated before looking up. "His body was never officially sent to the morgue." Maria felt her stomach drop. Never sent to the morgue. Then where was he? Maria felt as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. Her hands clenched into fists as she stared at the receptionist. "What do you mean his body was never sent to the morgue?" Her voice was steady, but inside, panic was rising like a storm. The receptionist looked just as confused. She turned the screen slightly toward Maria and Mark, pointing at a section in the hospital records. "Look here," she said. "Daniel was admitted to the emergency room after the accident. His injuries were severe, but according to this, his condition was still being monitored." Maria leaned in, reading every word carefully. It confirmed what the receptionist was saying. There was no mention of his death, no record of his body being taken to the morgue. But if that was true, how had she been given a coffin? How had a funeral even been arranged? Mark swallowed hard. "Maria, this doesn't make sense. If he was still being monitored, where did things go wrong? Who told you he had passed away?" Maria's heart pounded as she remembered the phone call. "It was someone from the hospital," she said slowly, replaying the memory in her mind. "A man called me. He said Daniel didn't survive. He told me the hospital would take care of the arrangements and that the body would be sent directly to the funeral home. Asterisk, asterisk." The receptionist frowned. "That's strange. We don't usually do that. Family members are always given the option to see their loved ones before anything is finalized." Maria's breath caught in her throat. Why had she believed them so easily? Why hadn't she demanded to see Daniel before the funeral? She straightened her shoulders. I need to speak to the doctor who was in charge of my son's case, she said firmly. The receptionist hesitated, glancing at the screen again. The doctor listed here is Dr. Evan Carter, but he hasn't come to work in 2 days. Maria's skin prickled with unease. 2 days. That was right around the time she received the call about Daniel's passing. Mark stepped forward. Do you have his contact information? We need to find him. The receptionist shook her head. I can't give out personal information, but I can check if he's on duty tomorrow. Maria didn't have time to wait. She looked around the hospital lobby, her mind racing. There had to be someone who knew something. Suddenly, she spotted a nurse passing by. Without hesitation, she rushed over. Excuse me, Maria said quickly, trying to keep her emotions under control. Do you remember a patient named Daniel? He was brought in 2 days ago after an accident. The nurse paused, her forehead creasing in thought. Daniel. Yes, I remember him. Young man, dark hair, serious injuries. She glanced around before lowering her voice. But I thought he was transferred. Maria's heart nearly stopped. Transferred? Where? The nurse hesitated, looking uncomfortable. I'm not sure. There was a lot of confusion that night. A private ambulance came in, and suddenly, his file was marked as transferred. But I don't know where they took him. Maria felt like she couldn't breathe. A private ambulance. Who had taken her son? Mark's face darkened. This isn't a mistake, Maria. Someone took Daniel on purpose. The nurse shifted nervously. Listen, I shouldn't even be talking about this, but... She lowered her voice further. That night, I overheard something strange. One of the hospital administrators was arguing with a man in a suit. I heard the man say, "The family doesn't need to know." A chill ran down Maria's spine. Someone had kept the truth from her. Someone had taken her son. She straightened up, her fear turning into determination. I'm going to find him, she whispered, no matter what it takes. Maria's hands trembled, but not from fear, from anger. Someone had taken her son, and they had lied to her about his death. She had spent the last 2 days mourning, believing that Daniel was gone forever. But now, she knew the truth. He was alive, somewhere, and she was going to find him. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder. We need a plan, he said firmly. If someone wanted to hide Daniel, they won't make it easy for us to find him. Maria nodded, trying to calm herself. She turned back to the nurse, who looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might hear them talking. Please, Maria begged. Do you remember anything else? Who took him? What did they look like? The nurse hesitated, then spoke in a whisper. The man arguing with the hospital administrator. He wasn't wearing a doctor's coat. He looked more like a businessman. Expensive suit, serious face. And the ambulance that took Daniel. It wasn't one of ours. It was plain white, no hospital logo. Maria's stomach twisted. A private ambulance. A man in a suit. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. The nurse bit her lip. There's one more thing. I heard the administrator say the name Westwood facility. I don't know what that is, but it sounded important. Maria quickly pulled out her phone and typed the name into an online search. Her hand shook as she scrolled through the results. There were no hospitals or medical centers called Westwood facility, but after a few minutes, she found something strange. An old news article mentioning Westwood Private Research Center. It was located about an hour outside the city. Mark read over her shoulder. That place was shut down years ago. Why would they take Daniel there? Maria's heart pounded. There's only one way to find out. She turned back to the nurse. Thank you for helping me. Please, don't tell anyone we spoke. The nurse nodded quickly and hurried away, leaving Maria and Mark standing in the hospital hallway, filled with nervous energy. Mark sighed. We're really doing this, aren't we? Maria looked him in the eyes, her voice steady. I'm a mother. I will do anything to get my son back. Without another word, they rushed back to Mark's car. The drive to Westwood was tense. Maria stared out the window, gripping her phone tightly. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the road. A voice. Maria froze, pressing herself against the wall. Mark did the same. The voice was coming from a nearby room. The family doesn't know anything. The funeral happened as planned. They won't come looking. Maria's heart pounded. She recognized that voice. It was the same man who had called her. Another voice responded. Good. The subject is responding well to the treatment. We need more time before we move him. Maria's stomach turned. They were talking about Daniel. She clenched her fists. They had lied to her, stolen her son, and now they were doing something to him. The voices grew quieter as the men walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. Maria took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Did you hear that? Mark whispered. Maria nodded. They still have Daniel, and they're planning something. She peeked around the corner, making sure the coast was clear before motioning for Mark to follow. They continued down the hallway until they reached a large metal door with a restricted access sign. There was a security panel next to it, requiring a keycard. Maria's frustration grew. How were they supposed to get in? Then footsteps echoed from behind them. Maria and Mark spun around just as a man in a white coat walked toward them, flipping through a clipboard. He hadn't seen them yet. Mark acted fast. He reached forward, grabbed the man's arm, and pulled him into the shadows. The man barely had time to react before Mark covered his mouth. We don't want to hurt you, Maria whispered urgently, but we need your keycard. Now. The man's eyes widened with fear, but he nodded quickly, pulling the card from his pocket and handing it over. Maria grabbed it, then looked him in the eye. Where is Daniel? The man hesitated. Room 204, he finally said. Maria's pulse raced. She was close. She nodded at Mark, and they released the man. Then, without wasting another second, Maria swiped the keycard at the door. The lock clicked open. She was about to find her son. Maria swiped the keycard again, and the door to room 204 clicked open. The heavy steel door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a dimly lit room filled with medical equipment. The air smelled sterile, cold. The room was small but packed with machinery, monitors, wires, and what looked like old, unused equipment. But there, in the center of the room, was a bed, and on it, lying motionless, was Daniel. Maria's breath hitched. It was him. It was her son. She rushed forward, her heart racing as she reached for him. Daniel. Daniel, wake up. Her voice trembled with both relief and fear. His face was pale, and there were marks on his skin from the wires that had been attached to him. He looked as if he hadn't moved in days. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but it was clear he wasn't fully conscious. Mark stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room. What's going on here? He whispered. Why is he like this? Maria didn't answer at first. She just stroked Daniel's hand, willing him to wake up. The doctor had said he was alive. But why wasn't he awake? Why was he hooked up to all these machines? She glanced around the room, her mind racing. There was something off about the place. The equipment looked outdated, like it hadn't been used in years. Yet here Daniel was, connected to monitors and strange machines. I don't understand, Maria whispered to herself. She stood up, pacing as she looked around. Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. Look at this. Maria turned to find him by a small desk in the corner. He was flipping through some papers, a look of confusion on his face. These are patient records, he said, holding up a folder. He quickly scanned the pages. These are all about Daniel. But there's something strange here. These aren't normal medical records. These. Maria walked over, her eyes darting over the papers. They were filled with strange terms, medical jargon that didn't make sense. Some words were underlined in red, and a few phrases looked almost like experiments. What do you mean experiments? Maria asked, her voice shaking. Mark glanced up. There's talk here about his response to treatment, And something about subject testing. This isn't a regular hospital. This is something else. Maria's stomach twisted. This isn't just about his accident. They've been using him for something. What have they done to him? Before Mark could answer, the door behind them slammed open. Maria whipped around, her heart racing. A tall man in a white coat stood in the doorway, his expression cold and stern. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. Maria stood her ground. "Where is Dr. Carter? What's going on here? What have you done to my son?" The man stepped forward, his eyes flicking nervously to Daniel. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is a restricted area. You should not have come here." A voice. Maria froze, pressing herself against the wall. Mark did the same. The voice was coming from a nearby room. "The family doesn't know anything. The funeral happened as planned. They won't come looking." Maria's heart pounded. She recognized that voice. It was the same man who had called her. Another voice responded. "Good. The subject is responding well to the treatment. We need more time before we move him." Maria's stomach turned. They were talking about Daniel. She clenched her fists. They had lied to her, stolen her son, and now they were doing something to him. The voices grew quieter as the men walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. Maria took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered. Maria nodded. "They still have Daniel, and they're planning something." She peeked around the corner, making sure the coast was clear before motioning for Mark to follow. They continued down the hallway until they reached a large metal door with a restricted access sign. There was a security panel next to it, requiring a keycard. Maria's frustration grew. How were they supposed to get in? Then footsteps echoed from behind them. Maria and Mark spun around just as a man in a white coat walked toward them, flipping through a clipboard. He hadn't seen them yet. Mark acted fast. He reached forward, grabbed the man's arm, and pulled him into the shadows. The man barely had time to react before Mark covered his mouth. "We don't want to hurt you," Maria whispered urgently, "but we need your keycard. Now." The man's eyes widened with fear, but he nodded quickly, pulling the card from his pocket and handing it over. Maria grabbed it, then looked him in the eye. "Where is Daniel?" The man hesitated. "Room 204, he finally said. Maria's pulse raced. She was close. She nodded at Mark, and they released the man. Then, without wasting another second, Maria swiped the keycard at the door. The lock clicked open. She was about to find her son. Maria swiped the keycard again, and the door to room 204 clicked open. The heavy steel door creaked as it swung inward, revealing the dimly lit room filled with medical equipment. The air smelled sterile, cold. The room was small but packed with machinery, monitors, wires, and what looked like old, unused equipment. But there, in the center of the room, was a bed, and on it, lying motionless, was Daniel. Maria's breath hitched. It was him. It was her son. She rushed forward, her heart racing as she reached for him. "Daniel, Daniel, wake up." Her voice trembled with both relief and fear. His face was pale, and there were marks on his skin from the wires that had been attached to him. He looked as if he hadn't moved in days. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but it was clear he wasn't fully conscious. Mark stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room. "What's going on here?" he whispered. "Why is he like this?" Maria didn't answer at first. She just stroked Daniel's hand, willing him to wake up. The doctor had said he was alive. But why wasn't he awake? Why was he hooked up to all these machines? She glanced around the room, her mind racing. There was something off about the place. The equipment looked outdated, like it hadn't been used in years. Yet here Daniel was, connected to monitors and strange machines. "I don't understand," Maria whispered to herself. She stood up, pacing as she looked around. Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. "Look at this." Maria turned to find him by a small desk in the corner. He was flipping through some papers, a look of confusion on his face. "These are patient records," he said, holding up a folder. He quickly scanned the pages. "These are all about Daniel. But there's something strange here. These aren't normal medical records. These." Maria walked over, her eyes darting over the papers. They were filled with strange terms, medical jargon that didn't make sense. Some words were underlined in red, and a few phrases looked almost like experiments. "What do you mean, experiments?" Maria asked, her voice shaking. Mark glanced up. "There's talk here about his response to treatment, and something about subject testing. This isn't a regular hospital. This is something else." Maria's stomach twisted. This isn't just about his accident. They'd been using him for something. What have they done to him? Before Mark could answer, the door behind them slammed open. Maria whipped around, her heart racing. A tall man in a white coat stood in the doorway, his expression cold and stern. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. Maria stood her ground. "Where is Dr. Carter? What's going on here? What have you done to my son?" The man stepped forward, his eyes flicking nervously to Daniel. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is a restricted area. You should not have come here." Maria didn't flinch. "I'm his mother, and I want answers." The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around as if considering what to say. Then his face hardened. "You don't understand. You never will. This isn't something you can fix." Mark stepped in front of Maria, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean? What are you doing to him?" The man's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "You really don't want to know." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The man tensed, his eyes widening. "We have to go now," he hissed. Maria looked at him in confusion. "Go? Go where?" Before they could react, two more people burst into the room, their faces masked. They weren't doctors. They were security guards. The man in the white coat took a step back, signaling to the guards, "Get them out of here. Now." Maria's heart raced. She grabbed Mark's arm. "We need to leave now. But we're not done. We will find out what's happening here." They turned and ran, not looking back. The guards chased them down the hall, but Maria and Mark were fast. They'd reached the back exit, where the broken fence still stood. "Come on," Mark shouted. "We can make it out this way." As they squeezed through the opening, Maria looked back at the building, her chest tightening with fear. What was going on inside? What had they done to Daniel? The answers were still out there, but she was closer than ever to finding the truth. Maria and Mark ran through the darkened street, their breaths coming in short gasps. The cold night air stung their skin as they turned a corner, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the facility. Their hearts pounded in their chests, adrenaline rushing through their veins. They didn't stop to look back. They couldn't afford to be caught. Mark was the first to break the silence. "What now?" His voice was tense, but there was determination in it. Maria's mind was racing, trying to piece together everything that had just happened. "I don't know, but we can't give up now. I've seen enough to know they're hiding something. Someone took Daniel, and they've been experimenting on him. I won't let them get away with it." She gripped his arm, her fingers trembling slightly. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to find out who's behind all of this. Who are they? And why is Daniel part of whatever they're doing?" Maria took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts in her head. "We'll get the answers. We have to." She glanced around. They were still in the city, but they were far enough from the facility that they could regroup for a moment. Mark pulled out his phone, looking up the name of the facility again. What if this goes higher than we think? What if it's not just some rogue group? What if someone powerful is pulling the strings? Maria's stomach twisted at the thought. She'd always assumed the hospital was just a place that helped people. But now, The more she learned, the more it felt like she had stumbled onto something much darker. "We need to talk to people," Maria said, her voice low but firm. "Someone has to know more about this. We can't do it alone." Mark looked at her, his brow furrowed in thought. Who would we talk to? Someone inside the hospital might know, but after everything that's happened, they're not going to be very helpful. Maria's mind clicked. No, not the hospital. We need to talk to someone who's been close to the people behind this, someone who's seen what's really going on. Mark raised an eyebrow. Who do you have in mind? Maria thought for a moment. There's a reporter, someone who's been investigating strange medical practices. I remember reading about her a few months ago. She's been looking into companies that do illegal medical testing. Maybe she knows something about this facility. Mark's face lit up with hope. That's a great idea. But where do we find her? Maria quickly searched the name of the reporter she remembered, and a few results popped up. One of the articles mentioned an address, a small office downtown where the reporter worked. It wasn't far from where they were, so they decided to go. As they arrived at the building, Maria felt a small spark of hope. They entered the office, which was dimly lit, with stacks of papers and files covering almost every surface. A woman in her 30s sat behind a desk, typing quickly on a computer. Her name tag read Sophie Turner. Maria cleared her throat, walking up to the desk. "Excuse me, are you Sophie Turner, the reporter?" Sophie looked up, her expression cautious but curious. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" Maria didn't waste any time. "We need your help. My son, Daniel, has been taken by a group that's doing something awful to people. They're conducting illegal experiments. I think they're behind a place called the Westwood facility." Sophie leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing with interest. The Westwood facility. She glanced at her computer screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. "I've heard rumors about them. There's been a lot of hush-hush stuff going on around there. People have tried to get in, but no one has ever managed to get proof of what's happening inside." Maria felt her hope rise, but Sophie's next words made her pause. "If you're really going after them, it's not going to be easy. The people behind that place are dangerous. They'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe." Mark clenched his jaw, his eyes hardening. "We're not afraid of them. We just want our son back. We're not stopping until we get the truth." Sophie nodded slowly, seeming to size them up. After a moment, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a file. "This is everything I've gathered so far. It's not much, but it's a start. It should give you some direction. But be careful. Once you start digging, there's no turning back." Maria took the file from her, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of it in her hands, and she knew it was the key to getting the answers she so desperately needed. As they left the office, Maria felt the intensity of the task ahead. But they were getting closer. Every step brought her closer to Daniel. Maria clutched the file tightly as she and Mark made their way back to the car. The night air had turned colder, and every step seemed to carry the weight of their mission. They hadn't spoken much since leaving Sophie's office. The folder in Maria's hands was heavy with unanswered questions, and she could feel the tension between them. She was more determined than ever to find Daniel, but now the danger felt more real than before. "We need to go over everything carefully," Maria said, her voice steady, but her hands shaking slightly as she opened the file. Inside, there were a series of notes, photographs, and a list of names of people who had tried to expose the facility and had mysteriously disappeared. Maria scanned through it quickly, her eyes narrowing when she saw a name that seemed to repeat. "Dr. Carter. He's involved," she muttered to herself. "The same doctor from the facility. He's the key to everything." Mark leaned over, peering at the file. "We need to find him, then. If he's the one pulling the strings, he must know where Daniel is." Maria nodded. "Exactly. But we need to be careful. From what Sophie said, these people are dangerous. If we rush in without thinking, we could make things worse." They drove in silence for a while, both of them lost in their thoughts. The city lights passed by in a blur as they made their way toward the address Sophie had given them. It was a small, unmarked building on the outskirts of the city, located in a quiet, isolated area. Maria's heart raced as they approached. It didn't look like a place where they would find answers, but it was their only lead. As they parked, Mark glanced at her. "Are you ready for this?" Maria took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I don't have a choice. I have to do this, for Daniel." They exited the car and walked up to the building, its windows dark and uninviting. The front door was locked, and there was no sign of anyone inside. Maria hesitated, then knocked firmly on the door. Seconds later, the door creaked open, and a man in his late 50s stood in the doorway. His face was tired, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Maria took a step forward, her heart beating faster. "We're looking for Dr. Carter. We need to talk to him. It's urgent." The man's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. "You're not the first people to come looking for him," the man said as they stepped inside. The building was dimly lit, and the air smelled stale. He led them down a narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Maria's mind raced as they followed him. Could this be a trap? Were they walking into another ambush? The man stopped at a door at the end of the hallway and knocked once before pushing it open. Inside, a desk sat cluttered with papers, and a single lamp illuminated the room. Behind the desk, a man in a lab coat sat with his back to them. He turned slowly in his chair, revealing a face Maria recognized instantly: Dr. Carter. His eyes widened for a brief moment, but his face quickly returned to its neutral expression. "I wondered when you'd find me." His voice was cold, but there was an underlying tension in it that made Maria's stomach twist. "Where is my son?" Maria asked, her voice trembling with urgency. Dr. Carter stood up, pushing his chair back. He didn't seem surprised by the question. "I'm afraid your son is no longer in my care. The experiments on him are ongoing, but there is little I can do to help him now." Maria felt a surge of anger rise within her. "What have you done to him? What experiments? He's not a test subject." Dr. Carter's expression didn't change. "You don't understand. Daniel was chosen for something much bigger than himself. The treatments he's undergoing are part of something that could change everything. He's integral to what we're trying to achieve." Maria clenched her fists. "I don't care about your experiments. All I care about is bringing him home." The man's eyes softened for just a moment, as though he were struggling with something inside. Then his expression hardened again. "It's too late. The process has already begun. There's no going back." Mark stepped forward, his voice low but forceful. "Then help us. You've seen what this is doing to people. You know it's wrong. If you care at all, you'll help us save him." Dr. Carter seemed to hesitate. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at them. Then, slowly, he spoke. "There may be a way to reverse it, but it's risky. If we try, there's no guarantee he'll survive. And even if he does, there's no telling what he might become." Maria's heart stopped. "We don't care what he becomes. We just want him back." Dr. Carter nodded slowly, as if resigned to what he had to do. "Then we need to hurry. There's little time left."